Welcome to the Totally Adequate podcast, produced by Quest Analytics. Here, we dive into the latest news, policies, and innovations in healthcare provider network management with industry leaders who are shaping the future of care. Our mission? To elevate community health across the nation through superior provider networks.
Welcome back to the Totally Adequate podcast. I'm April Beane, and I'm really glad you're here today. Our policy experts, who you've gotten to know month over month, that's Zach and Kate here from Quest Analytics, had a chance recently to go to a conference that was very focused on the Medicare and Medicaid duals population. And it's got us thinking. So we want to take you to a pre-recorded conversation where Zach was presenting with Tricia Beckmann and Kacey Dugan from Faegre Drinker. And they were talking very specifically about the duals payers and population, in particular around network adequacy, about state oversight, regulatory compliance, and what plans are doing around innovation and innovative solutions in order to really enhance care for this particular population. So I'm going to let you join that conversation, and then we'll break it down a little bit when it's done.
Welcome, everyone. I am pleased today to be talking about driving network adequacy for dual eligibles, challenges and solutions. We have a disclaimer here. I won't read that word for word, but this is sensitive, proprietary, and confidential material. Today, you'll be hearing from a variety of speakers. I am Zach Snyder. I am our Vice President of Government Affairs here at Quest Analytics. Here at Quest Analytics, I lead our work with state departments of insurance, state Medicaid agencies, and federal agencies such as CMS. And I'll let the other presenters introduce themselves.
Thanks, Zach. Hi, I'm Tricia Beckmann. I'm a principal at Faegre Drinker Consulting. We work closely with Quest on government health programs and policy, and we're happy to speak to the regulatory requirements pertaining to dual eligible plans in particular. And we also wanted to note that we work with a variety of clients, providers, and health plans on regulatory and policy issues across the spectrum. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Kacey Dugan.
Hi, I'm Kacey Dugan. I'm a director for policy and regulatory affairs at Faegre. And as Tricia said, we've been working with Zach on network adequacy, especially the regulatory considerations for several years now. I'm looking forward to the discussion today on network adequacy for dual eligibles.
Great. And so here's an overview of where we'll be discussing network adequacy as it relates to dual eligible plans. First, we'll give a very brief overview of network adequacy. We know that many of you already have a basis, if you're working with a health plan, on those types of standards and what the purpose of them is. We also will seek to define network adequacy as it relates to plans that are serving dual eligible beneficiaries, because there are some specific considerations when working, particularly with two different programs, Medicare Advantage and Medicaid Managed Care. And then we'll talk through what the requirements and specifically state-specific practices mean for plans that are serving dual eligibles. Talk through a little bit on the current and future trends in network adequacy regulation more broadly, but also in the area of plans serving dual eligibles more specifically, and then end with some points on how these specific types of plans can best serve these members. So first off, we'll just define network adequacy. This is the idea, and an important one that's really the foundation of the meaning of having health insurance, is having access to healthcare providers that can, meet you where you are and serve your health plan, your healthcare needs. And so regulators, since the inception really of managed care, have required health plans to demonstrate that they have enough providers that can meet the demand of their members by having sufficient types of providers and geographic dispersion of providers that can meet members where they are in each locality that the health plan is serving. And, obviously on the flip side, if you have an inadequate network, that can mean that members seek out-of-network care, which can mean that it's undermining the goals of affordability and coordinating care for health plans, lowering member satisfaction, and potentially leading to worse health outcomes as well. So there are some different ways to measure network adequacy, which have evolved over time, both on the quantitative side, meaning these maximum time and distance standards and provider to enrollee ratios or wait time standards that you may have heard about, and then also qualitative standards like using a complaints-based process to review complaints and understand the patterns of care for out-of-network care to understand if there's a care gap. This slide goes into, at a high level, the general authorities that each types of plans listed here must look at when thinking about what are my network adequacy standards. So for Medicare Advantage plans, traditional Medicare Advantage plans, there are federally established standards by CMS. DSNPs, or dually eligible special needs plans, are subject to both Medicare Advantage and state-defined standards, and we'll discuss this very deeply in the discussion to come. Institutional special needs plans are a smaller type of special needs plan that serves individuals who are in a skilled nursing facility or would be eligible for an institutional level of care. And they're generally subject to most Medicare Advantage standards with some exceptions. Medicaid managed care, obviously a huge program serving 3/4 of folks that are enrolled in Medicaid today. And those are subject to state-defined standards with some federal parameters discussing what are the minimum expectations that states have when defining network adequacy in their state. Medicare Medicaid plan is a demonstration plan. It's actually one that is probably not going to be as relevant going forward, as the MMPs are going to be sunsetted and largely converted over to DSNP plans. But those have been subject to CMS and state-specific standards as well. And then PACE is an interesting and still a permanent aspect of the healthcare ecosystem, and those specific plans that are serving a very high acute population of folks that are also eligible for Medicare and Medicaid are served generally by state-specific standards as well, with some federal standards too. Okay, so a closer look at MA network adequacy standards. They are, any plan that is a network-based plan has to comply with the regulatory standards, and CMS's standards in its regulations are really seen as a gold standard approach for a time and distance standard. And certainly they have influenced in large part other programs, including state Medicaid standards and the CMS marketplace federal standards for federal exchange plans. We're not going to go into all of this information, but you can see that there's a number of specialty types that are reviewed to demonstrate the availability of providers to enrollees. Given the acuity of the Medicare population, there's a lot of specialists that are expected to be available to this population. The next slide goes into some of the more specific standards. You can kind of see what this looks like in greater detail. So CMS buckets counties served by MA plans by type, large metro, micro, rural, and sort of considered a frontier county, or one that is in large part, acknowledged to be an area that has a low number of providers in the area because it's very rural. And CMS's standards, they're both time and distance and minimum numbers or provider ratio numbers that you see here. So taking one example, 85% of beneficiaries in a micro, rural, or a frontier county and 90% in large and metro counties must have access to at least one provider or facility of each type within the time and distance standards. Recently, relatively recently, now 5 years ago or so, CMS instituted a telehealth credit that essentially lowers that 85% number, for example, to allow the health plan to meet access to care through the use of telehealth providers. All right. And in terms of Medicaid, as I noted earlier, there is a relatively generic or general federal floor for states. They have to develop some type of quantitative network standard, at least one. But other than for appointment wait times, there aren't as many prescriptive requirements in terms of the quantitative information that you saw on the previous slide. But CMS does expect that Medicaid programs at least identify quantitative standards for the following providers listed here. And you can see by the list that these are ones that are very frequently used by Medicaid beneficiaries. So now we'll get to the implications for plans that are serving dual eligibles given this landscape. So what does this all mean for a specific Medicaid plan serving dually eligible beneficiaries, a dually eligible special needs plan? So DSNPs, as a foundational matter, are a type of Medicare Advantage plan. So they must meet the relevant Medicare Advantage network adequacy standards. Plus, they are subject to state level requirements. And those are typically, though not always, but typically found in the state Medicaid agency contract or accompanying documents like appendices or maybe even an RFP that's referenced, potentially also regulations. So you kind of have to look at a number of areas to make sure that you have all of the universe of requirements for a DSNP plan as it relates to state requirements. And because this type of plan serves a more acute population, people that tend to have, serious chronic conditions and are responsible for, the lion's share of spending, both in the Medicare program and a state Medicaid program, there tends to be a higher expectation potentially, depending on the state preferences for network standards, making sure that those individuals are part of a medical home and are having their care coordinated as much as possible with an in-network provider care team. So we usually find that ultimately Medicaid standards are usually less stringent because Medicare Advantage is considered the gold standard, but they certainly can go further in the future. And I think that is something we'll pick up on as a trend to come. So I'll turn it over to Kacey Dugan to talk through some state examples that we wanted to highlight.
Yes, thank you. So here is an example of, as Tricia was saying, how MA and state network adequacy standards can be similar but different enough to be relevant for DSNPs as a consideration. So in this case, Tennessee's Medicaid program, TennCare, has similar but less strict standards than MA, but the DSNP must still meet the stricter of the two standards. So for example, in TennCare, rural specialists have similar requirements, similar distance requirements as Medicare Advantage, but the travel time is longer. So this can account for things such as mountain roads that you must drive slow on, for example. And then the percent of enrollees who must be able to access a provider within the max time and distance standards is lower, 75% versus 85%. And additionally, provider ratio requirements are less strict. So all of these things can be enough to make it meaningfully harder for, say, a Medicaid plan in Tennessee to add a DSNP or for any DSNP or MA plan to enter the market. So on this slide, we outline some of the considerations and issues in meeting two sets of requirements that can make it challenging to offer a DSNP. First, we see incongruities between federal and state regulators. The standards they set and how compliance is monitored can differ and mean that a DSNP would need to meet two or more even sets of requirements and processes. Notably, as we saw with the Tennessee example, MA requirements are set at the federal level, and they're based on population size and demographics of the general Medicare Advantage population, as opposed to Medicaid provider network adequacy standards, which vary by state, are established by the state, and are thus more likely to account for state-specific circumstances. And this has been highlighted as one of the underlying reasons for the difficulty in standing DSNPs in rural areas in particular. Second, CMS evaluates network adequacy for MA plans at the contract level rather than at the plan level. So except for MA organizations that have DSNP only contracts, any MA organization may include both regular MA plans and DSNPs in their contract level, meaning that a DSNP's provider network could meet Medicare Advantage network adequacy standards at the contract level, but not Medicaid standards in a given service area. So this is actually an example of how it could be easier to meet the MA standards than the Medicaid standards. Third, Medicaid-specific benefits. So, for example, MA network adequacy reviews do not consider the availability of Medicaid's non-emergency medical transportation or NEMT benefit, which is available for dual eligibles, even if an MA plan is offering a transportation supplemental benefit. And having that benefit, which is an access facilitator, may be baked into the network adequacy standards for MCOs as opposed to the MA side. And fourth, MA organizations can drop counties from their service areas if they are unable to meet network adequacy in those counties. But this would pose a problem in states where a Medicaid managed care plan or an MLTSS plan, for example, is actually also required to offer a DSNP. So if the MA organization cannot offer a DSNP in a service area, then its companion Medicaid plan could lose its contract for that same area, including for the whole population, not just for the DSNP eligible population. Okay, so if you're like me, when I started thinking about this and hearing about this issue, you may think, well, if a DSNP has exclusively aligned enrollment, as more of them do these days, meaning full benefit DSNP enrollees are receiving their Medicaid MCO and Medicare benefits from the same MCO, it would make sense that the plan would be able to meet both sets of requirements with an aligned provider network. But even with the push for a higher level of integration, the majority of DSNPs are still coordination only and do not have aligned provider networks. And in practice, even if a DSNP and Medicaid MCO are offered by the same or related companies, networks may not completely overlap. Certain providers may only be in the DSNP or only in the Medicaid MCO network, but not both. And this can create network gaps and for enrollees, accessing continuity of care issues and dissatisfaction. For example, when an MCO enrollee ages into Medicare and has the opportunity to enroll in the companion DSNP, but isn't able to continue with their own longtime doctor for the long term. Anticipating these gaps is paramount, as is anticipating and considering what states might be thinking as they seek to leverage their state Medicaid agency contracting authority to push towards a higher level of integration. And that brings us to the next session in our discussion, which is on current and future trends in network adequacy. So one trend I wanted to highlight in DSNPs in particular, in DSNP contracts in particular, is the use of network congruency standards. Several states have these, and they have been phasing them in over time. So, for example, California requires DSNPs to report annually on the extent to which networks are aligned, and recommends a 90% alignment percentage, meaning that 90% of providers participate in both programs. New York requires DSNPs to augment the narrower network, whether that's Medicare or Medicaid, to develop a network of at least 85% overlap, and prohibits the termination of providers for the sole purpose of achieving that threshold, which is why they require augmentation of the narrower network. Washington requires 95% alignment in each county where a DSNP is offered, and they actually prohibit DSNPs from being marketed or represented as highly integrated if this threshold is not reached. And then other states require things like substantial overlap or just overlap. And then Arizona, Michigan, and California require providers that take both Medicare and Medicaid to be identified in the provider directory. And some of them actually extend those to non-exclusively aligned plans also. More broadly, trends in serving duals that are relevant to this discussion. I know there is a lot of content on discussion on these trends at this conference, so I won't go too far into details, but I think generally seeing a push to integrate further could lead to growth in plans that do have exclusively aligned enrollment. We may see more of those network congruency standards. For supplemental benefits, hearing about more states requiring DSNPs to coordinate supplemental benefits with Medicaid benefits, which can have provider network implications, and then automatically assigning DSNP enrollees to aligned Medicaid plans or assigning Medicaid enrollees to aligned DSNPs upon turning to 65. Those have implications for network alignment and congruency, as well as I mentioned on a previous slide. And then in terms of broader issues in network adequacy, we have seen continued emphasis from regulators on time and distance and other quantitative metrics, as opposed to a more comprehensive approach that combines different qualitative methods of network review and access review. Over the last 4 years, we have seen several actions to increase network adequacy standards and oversight of networks across multiple different programs and lines of business at the federal level, including Medicaid, Medicare Advantage, as well as QHP. And that trend might be unlikely to continue under the new administration. We could see rollbacks of some of those requirements, but too soon to tell at this moment in time. And then lastly, a trend that Zach is going to discuss more in a moment, which is increasing concern about ghost networks, which are essentially when a substantial portion of supposedly in-network providers are not actually in practice accepting new patients, not practicing within the geographic area, or might not actually accept members of certain plans very often. So I'll turn it over to Zach to elaborate on that.
So thank you, Kacey, and thank you, Tricia, for that wonderful overview of how states and how the federal government treats dual eligibles when it comes to network adequacy. It's incredibly complex, and I'm so glad to be working with experts like you on helping plans navigate this. Like I said at the beginning, at Quest Analytics, we partner with a variety of state departments of insurance, state Medicaid agencies, and CMS itself to help them measure and monitor whether or not health plans are meeting network adequacy standards. We also work with the majority of health plans across the country. And through that work, one of the things that we're able to do is really see where all of the trends are lying in network adequacy. And there are many trends, but today I want to talk about probably the most pressing trend, and that has to do with ghost networks. And generally this idea of requiring health plans to have more accurate provider directories. So here on the screen, I have outlined 4 policymakers representing 4 different states. And in the quotes here, and I won't read them word for word, they are talking about the need for new policy to address the issue of so-called ghost networks. Like Kacey said, these are providers that are listed in a provider directory, but for whatever reason aren't actually available to treat members, to treat patients. And for better or for worse, these policymakers are blaming the health plans for this problem. And we all know that the problem is multifaceted. It's not just the health plans. The data that the health plans get is only as good as the data that the provider gives them. But for better or for worse, the policymakers are placing the blame for ghost networks on the health plans and are looking for policy solutions, placing new network adequacy requirements on health plans. So we have everyone from the Attorney General of New York State to the Governor of Illinois making this a big issue. But we all know that policymakers talk a lot and we don't see a lot of action. But with ghost networks, we actually have seen quite a bit of action in all of the states represented here. I won't read all of these word for word, but what we're seeing is a clear trend to address ghost networks, and that is to require health plans to bring in some level of claims data to make a determination of whether or not a provider is actually available in a given line of business to provide care to that patient. So maybe a provider isn't seeing patients in the Medicaid line of business, and we don't see any claims activity in the Medicaid line of business, but we see claims activity in the commercial line of business. So that's an indication that while they are a provider that has an active contract with a health plan, that they're not actually available. So we're seeing states place requirements on health plans that says you have to go into your provider networks and really make a determination of, are these providers actually available? Is there claims data activity? So we see examples. We have a final rule in New York that just passed on both the commercial and the Medicaid side. We have a regulation on the commercial side in Illinois. We have a proposal moving right now through the state of California that would require plans in the state of California on the commercial side to do a level of claims-based analysis to determine the accuracy of their provider directories. So this is a clear trend. This is just a slice of some examples. But it's a very interesting trend, and we're working with states to help them implement new ways to measure and monitor whether or not the health plans are meeting this standard. In addition, we're working with the health plans to make sure that they have a system in place to where they can really understand, is there claims activity from a provider, and flag that so that you as a health plan can make a decision of whether or not you want to include that provider in your directory. So let's talk about some of those strategies that we've really developed with health plans, working side by side with them. So the first piece is the submission accuracy. And it's really important when you are submitting your network filings to a state or even to the federal government that there are certain data quality checks that occur. So that includes verifying MPIs, looking at the Medicare opt-out and precluded list, looking at the OIG screening list, and also looking for excess specialty locations. So is a provider practicing in 55 locations? Probably not. So flagging that. For example, on the federal exchange side, CMS is now saying if a provider is practicing in more than 10 locations, that you have to exclude that provider. So that is a trend we're seeing, and we could see that move across different jurisdictions as well. So it's really important to use data and use analytics to have a screen of your provider data to ensure that it's quality data. Then the next piece is, like I said, identifying the ghost providers. And in the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about how we view that. And it's really important to note, I was talking with my colleagues before presenting today about ghost providers. This is not a technical term that's been defined in any law that exists. So it's really up to us as an industry to define what that means and make decisions in our own plans about how we deal with ghost providers. And we can talk about what that looks like. Here at Quest Analytics, we look at ghosts, defining ghosts in four ways. There's ghost providers, there's peripheral providers, standard providers, and core providers. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means. So ghost providers are providers who don't see any patients. There's no claims data in that line of business, and that's what we call a ghost provider. A peripheral provider, we would see them at the bottom 25% of patient volume. A standard provider, 50%, and a core provider at the top 25%. Now, plans, they can define that in any way that makes sense for their plan, but this is what we suggest for the plans that we work with, and we've seen a lot of success working with plans in using this notion of ghost, peripheral, standard, and core. In addition, states are very interested in this idea as well. Again, it's a new area, so states are beginning to roll out claims data and what that means for health plans. We'll see where that lands. But this is a very interesting concept, and we're very excited to bring it to health plans and bring it to states. And then finally, one of the things that I wanted to point out today is identifying inaccurate locations as well. This is a big issue, and really looking at, is that practitioner practicing at that location? And we have data analytics that help states and help health plans really make a determination if that provider is actually practicing. So when you use data analytics, data quality checks, location checks, and ghost provider checks, you're going to have a more accurate provider directory and really be up for meeting this trend of this increased scrutiny on health plans and providing accurate provider directories to beneficiaries. So with that, I will end our presentation here today. And I really appreciate everyone's attention, and I appreciate working with my colleagues on this issue. Thank you for your time.
Welcome back. I hope you found that conversation as interesting as I did. A lot of information to take in. You may want to watch it again just to really think about how plans are starting to enhance care for their members, in particular around the dual eligibles. One of the really interesting things I find about that Zach talks about all the time is about ghost providers and how regulators are really starting to focus in on this. They're starting to look at claims data and how plans are using innovative solutions in order to try and eliminate ghosts from their networks. So if you want to learn more about the policy trends and things that are happening around ghost providers, around dual eligibles, I highly recommend that you watch the monthly health policy updates that Zach and Kate do right here on the Totally Adequate podcast. There's a library of them. We do them every month. And also stay tuned. We have a whole lineup of thought leadership podcasts coming your way in 2025. And I look forward to having you join us and listen in. We know you have a lot of different options when it comes to podcasts and things that you listen to. We're just really glad you joined us here. Don't forget to give us some feedback. It's really beneficial. It helps us better the show for you. And again, thanks for watching.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Totally Adequate podcast. If you enjoyed it, we'd appreciate it if you could rate us on Spotify or leave a review on your preferred podcast platform. Your feedback helps us grow and bring you even better content. We also invite you to send us any comments or topic ideas by emailing us at thetotallyadequatepodcast@questanalytics.com. The Totally Adequate podcast is produced by Fowler House Films and Quest Analytics. Thank you for listening.